Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT. And today we have Glenn Olcerst. He is the co-founder and general counsel of Rail Pollution Protection Pittsburgh, RP3. And for over a decade, Glenn and RP3 have countered industrial rail expansion in the Pittsburgh region, which is among the most intensively used corridor for transportation of hazardous chemicals and volatile oil in North America. So RP3's tactics against Norfolk Southern include grassroots campaigns, administrative litigation, injunctions, and court-ordered mediation to protect environmental justice areas and neighborhoods. Glenn obtained a significant monetary settlement from Norfolk Southern for EJA neighborhoods in mitigation for the impact of Norfolk Southern's vertical clearance project. And Glenn's specialty relates to rail safety failure points, federal and state policy reform, and action items. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. And I want to welcome you, Glenn. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And so if we want to go to the next slide, tell us a little bit about you, a little bit more about you, Glenn, and what our RP3 does.
Well, RP3's mission is to counteract the risk and impacts that expanding rail transport and related facilities have on adjacent communities in terms of health, safety, and air and water quality. Barbara Tallarico, my wife, and I started our campaign against Norfolk Southern in 2011 to try and save 3-century-old trees in our historic park. And after I retired in 2018, together we formed RP3 after gaining a better understanding that the railroad was threatening more than just our trees. Incidentally, those trees are still standing.
Nice. That's great work. Yeah. And so we're going to really focus our conversation today on something that has been in the press recently. A lot of folks probably have heard about everything that happened in East Palestine, Ohio. And, there are neighboring communities here in Pennsylvania, very close to Pittsburgh. And so the focus of our conversation today is really going to be around that incident. And so I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of video footage from news outlets and other folks in the field as Glenn starts the conversation here. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And go ahead, Glenn. There we go. All right. So that should be good to go. Yeah. So you were talking about how East Palestine, it's described here in some of these videos as kind of an apocalyptic situation here. Let me close this. Can you talk a little bit about what your opinion of why this failure happened and whether it was avoidable or not?
Well, one cause is Norfolk Southern's culture from top down. And, I've talked to numerous whistleblowers, and actually the following poem was routinely scratched into the walls of most Norfolk Southern locomotives. I think it pretty much says it all. It goes like this: uphill slow, downhill fast, product first, safety last. And in connection with the East Palestine disaster, you heard that Norfolk Southern broke no laws. And that is the problem. Our regulatory system is broken, and corporate greed and regulatory failure have again put the public and your neighborhoods at risk. And I'll use the East Palestine derailment to illustrate the problem because that derailment and the release and burn were apparently entirely unnecessary and completely avoidable. And to fully understand what I just said, we need to start by following the money. The New York Times recently revealed that railroads donated $454 million to our U.S. congressional representatives over the past 2 decades. Now, what the railroads got for their money was an easing of existing safety regulations in return for the railroad promising to responsibly self-regulate. We now know that this experiment in trust has failed as surely as the Norfolk Southern's train left the tracks and damaged the lives and livelihood of everyone in the East Palestine area. As it turns out, turning over regulatory authority to industries whose executives earn bonuses on profits was never a good idea for the public or for the environment. Consider the Volkswagen diesel emissions fraud and the Boeing 737 MAX debacle. And we are going to continue to have increasing number of epic derailments because of self-regulation and because of the adoption by Norfolk Southern of the precision scheduled railroading business model known as PSR.
All right. And we have just a comment in the chat, I believe, and it says there's nothing controlled about Norfolk Southern's decision to do that burn.
Yeah, that is exactly on point. And I would have better have said uncontrolled burn. You're exactly on point.
Yeah, yeah. So you had mentioned this precision scheduled railroading. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means in some plain English here?
Yeah. Stated simply, that business model requires strict on-time departure and arrival.
So that kind of like, if you think about the poem again, it seems like that, and what you were talking about the culture, it seems like that pretty much says it all. That your on time, your on time departure and on time schedule is the most important thing for them. So, tell us a little bit more about, this incident that happened and why it's important for them to remain with this schedule.
Well, on its face, and simply stated as I did, it doesn't sound alarming or unreasonable,
Right.
but it is premised. That business model is premised on a 30 to 40% cut in staff. And that includes locomotive engineers, maintenance, and inspectors. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. So, um, how does that translate into what happens in the railroad yard itself?
Well, in the rail yards, it means a quote grab and go, unsafe assembly of rail cars, whatever's ready before the departure deadline. Now, the East Palestine train itself was unsafe because it was 151 cars long, or 1.76 miles, and heavier rail cars were assembled behind empty rail cars. And when the Civil War era air brake system was applied, the front of the train was braked, but the signal to stop, which travels car by compressed air, had not yet reached the heavier cars in the rear. pushing the empty cars off the track. Now, Norfolk Southern chose not to use electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, which will 40 to 60% faster. This is possible because an electronic brake signals travels from the front to the rear at the speed of light.
Okay. So I guess I didn't realize that how important it is to put the cars in a proper order. So you would have heavier cars, in a certain spot in the, whole rail system. And this is really interesting. I think that a lot of people aren't going to under are going to hopefully come into this conversation knowing a lot more about this than they came into the conversation, which is kind of the purpose of the lunch and learn, so people can learn about this situation and how we can hopefully fix it for the future. So what else? What else is happening in the rail yard that shouldn't be happening right now?
Well, what's actually not happening is the most important. And according to Norfolk Southern whistleblowers, this business model also means that rail car inspection times in the yard were cut, leaving barely enough time for the locomotive engineers to even connect the Civil War era brake lines. Let alone do a thorough safety inspection.
And so how does that relate to what happened with the East Palestine derailment?
Recall that the derailment was caused by a wheel bearing failure. Now, this kind of rolling stock failure could happen anywhere, including your backyards. And that's why we're having this lunch and learn, because this isn't just East Palestine. This is anywhere a rail line runs in your community or throughout Pennsylvania. And immediately after the derailment, the National Transportation Safety Board chair, her name is Hamidi, said on the news that the derailment was entirely avoidable. And one reason for that is because a wheel bearing that is about to completely fail visibly leaks oil and could have been discovered with an adequate inspection. And if that had occurred at that point, that train would have been pulled out of service before it even left the yard.
So it sounds like there's a couple different issues here at play. It sounds like you were talking about where the cars are located within the line. It also talks about, you were also talking about the inspection of the cars themselves, right? Are there alarms that go off when like a car or a wheel would overheat to let them know that that there's a problem?
Yeah, those are hot box detectors, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Okay.
But um, you know, the reason why these inspections are being cut short is that while Norfolk Southern touts safety behind closed doors, they promote profits over prudence. And we know this because of what was said in a complaint that was filed in U.S. District Court for Western Pennsylvania. And the FLSA whistleblower lawsuit was filed on behalf of Russell Puzowski, a Norfolk Southern locomotive engineer for 21 years working out of the Conway Rail Yard in Beaver County. And, what's really revealing is a couple of quotes from that complaint. So here are some highlights. During a 3-month period, engineer Puzowski discovered 40 federal safety rule violations that took these trains carrying onboard hazardous material out of service or delayed their departure. Puzowski was told that the local management team could, quote, no longer tolerate the delays because it was causing them to get their asses chewed out by their supervisors, unquote, and that on-time departure, quote, was more important than adequate pre-departure inspection. Now, Puzowski says he was fired for caring and for taking too much time to inspect hazardous trains. Without regard to the outcome of his lawsuit filed in May of 2021, which is still pending, the rest of the inspectors get the message. And this kind of pressure is happening at rail yards all over this country. And that East Palestine train passed through 3 rail yard inspections before getting to East Palestine. Now, understand that the reporting of unsafe locomotive conditions and the refusal to operate a locomotive that has not been properly inspected is required by federal law. So this case is important because it calls into question whether there's a system-wide, top-down pressure on engineers to shortcut inspections. And there's a headline from a recent article in The Guardian that touts, as you've seen in the slide, leaked audio reveals U.S. rail workers told to skip inspections. This is a national problem, people. And East Palestine is a huge, fiery alarm bell because that train might never have derailed if it had been inspected properly before it left the yard.
And so if people wanted to get their hands on the report that you were talking about, Glenn, how would they go about doing that?
It's a U.S. Federal District Court complaint, and I can give folks the citation.
Yeah, if you have the docket number or a link, I think that's pretty crucial information for people that are interested in this topic to
Yeah.
read
So
up. Go.
I have it here. It's Puzowski, PuzauskY versus Norfolk Southern Corp. Docket number 221, CV00606. It's Western District of Pennsylvania. It was filed May 21st, 2021.
Great. All right. So people can look at that, complain for themselves, and I think that's really important information. Do you have any sense of why this case is still ongoing? It's been since May 2021.
Norfolk Southern makes it really hard in the first instance for whistleblowers to even file a complaint. And the whistleblower statute, federal statute, is very complicated. You need a lawyer who's willing to take your case. And then Norfolk Southern slow walks all of that litigation to drive up your legal costs. And that's all to their advantage. And that's what's happening here in numerous cases.
And so can you tell us a little bit about, a little bit more about why the requirement of this precision scheduling railroading really kind of puts the public at risk?
Well, I mentioned strict departure times, but there's also strict on-time arrival. And Norfolk Southern has staked their business future on meeting the scheduled arrival time. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is how they attract business and get and keep those customers. So many manufacturers and businesses have reduced their warehouse or storage space to save money and depend on just-on-time deliveries. Now, all of the Class 1 railroads have embraced this same business model, but Norfolk Southern is in a class of its own in this regard because its biggest customer is UPS. So, failure to make the delivery time could lose them a critically important customer and have a major impact on their bottom line.
So when you say they're in a class of their own, what do you mean?
Well, Norfolk Southern has a written rule. They actually have a written rule that managers can disregard safety alarms and tell a train to continue or maybe just slow down. Those alarms from the hot box. A derailment of a Norfolk Southern coal train occurred again just a few weeks ago because of this policy being exercised, and that policy I'm discussing is attracting attention. ProPublica asked the other six Class 1 rail lines if they had a similar policy. Four said no.
Okay.
One of the four said no one could or should ever disregard a stop the train safety alarm, and two didn't respond. Now, this business model accounts for a trickle down series of risks for everyone. We're bearing the risk, but it gives Norfolk Southern, as one example, the ability to make $18 billion in stock buybacks, to award record bonuses to its executives, and to make record profits for the corporation.
Okay. So that's interesting, and I think that goes back to your discussion earlier about just the fact that safety, it doesn't seem that safety is a priority. And the reason why it isn't is because they want to get the product there on time. And that those shortcuts, like you said, are happening all the time. And it seems like there are federal laws that are in place that are supposed to help with this situation, but it seems like they're just going around those federal laws or ignoring them. And is that what just to kind of recap, is that what the whistleblower case really is about?
Well, the laws are written purposely vaguely and ambiguously,
Okay.
and there are regulations that are administered by the Federal Rail Administration that have even more loopholes in them. And the reason for all of that is that the FRA is administered uh, by former rail and petrochemical executives and lobbyists. And so there are plenty of loopholes. Let me give you an example, a specific example. We all remember that Norfolk Southern had 20, was that train had 20 cars carrying hazardous material. But it wasn't classified as a hazardous train, which gets extra special safety inspections. And the reason for that is the federal regulations written by the FRA say 20 contiguous cars, hazardous rail cars, contiguous, one after the other. And so what happens is they move the 20th car, they put other cars, empty rail cars, between the 19th hazardous rail car and the 20th. So it's not all 20 in a row, which is what the regulations require. It's a loophole.
And
And we're all suffering for that.
right, and kind of to go back to the statement that you had made earlier about the position of the cars being important.
Mhm.
I would think that, that is kind of in conflict with this method of making sure that there aren't the contiguous cars. I mean, I feel like I understand a little bit about, well, if there are, 10 contiguous cars of hazardous chemicals, which to me, one car of hazardous chemicals would be enough, right? For
Mhm.
something to be triggered, but you're saying 20 contiguous, but if those hazardous chemicals are a different weight, just kind of back to our conversation about, the way that the cars are put on the tracks is important. That weight would be also, and the distribution of weight would be important as well. And so it seems like these two things are a little bit in conflict.
Well, let me say that slightly differently. Norfolk Southern will build a train um, in the fastest way possible, without regard to where they're putting cars. But when it comes to um, building a train to their advantage, they will make sure to split up the hazardous cars so that they don't fall within the strictures of this safety rule.
Okay. And as you pointed out, it sounds like these executives that are the ones that stand to profit from regulations being made to benefit them are the ones that are making the regulations. It's very similar to what we see in the oil and gas industry, right? In the petrochemical industry, that the regulators are often guided by the folks in the industry that stand to profit from the regulation, or lack, I should say, lack of regulations, or in this case, a loophole that exists. So to me, it's not surprising, but it might be to other folks, watching this program. And so, tell me a little bit about, I know that there was the burning of, or release of this vinyl chloride, and so, in your opinion, was that a decision that needed to happen? Was that something that needed to happen, or was there another way to approach it that didn't happen?
Well, great question. When railroads self-regulate and cut corners, whole communities will suffer for decades. Because as we saw in East Palestine, what we also got was the apparently unnecessary release and burn of 115,580 gallons of highly toxic, flammable vinyl chloride. Now, I say that because 2 days of National Transportation Safety Board hearings revealed that the manufacturer of the vinyl chloride had stabilized the vinyl chloride mixture by removing the oxygen before it was loaded into the rail cars so that it would not explode.
Wow.
They had shared that information with both Norfolk Southern and Norfolk Southern's consultants before the decision to release and burn was made. Here's the kicker: Norfolk Southern withheld that information from the Unified Emergency Response Command and from the governor of Ohio.
Wow.
Now, according to the testimony at that NTSB hearing, Keith Drabick, who's the chief of East Palestine's volunteer fire department and the one who made the final decision to vent and burn those chemicals, what he said was um, he was told by Norfolk Southern's consultant that he had 13 minutes to make a decision of whether or not we were going to vent or burn because they were running out of daylight. He testified, quote, Norfolk Southern never told him that the manufacturer of oxyvinyls, that's the name of the manufacturer, oxyvinyls, had advised that it didn't believe polymerization was or could be occurring. Um, Remember also that Norfolk Southern originally justified the burn because of what it claimed were rising temperatures in one vinyl chloride car.
Okay.
Instead of just venting and burning that one car, they burned all 5 rail cars carrying vinyl chloride. Now, at the hearing, the NTSB presented a graph that showed the temperatures in the vinyl chloride tanker that Norfolk Southern claimed was its concern was on the downward trend before the chemical release and burn.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a real communication breakdown between the folks that are trying to make the best decisions on, with the information that they're given, and the railway itself, and then the manufacturer of this product. And it sounds like the manufacturer at least made efforts to ensure that the product being transported was, in a more safe format, right? Than maybe Norfolk Southern actually requires. I don't know, if that's required or not for them to do that, but it seems like, with all of what you've said, that it probably wasn't necessary for them to burn that. And that caused now, months and months of, toxic chemicals in streams and creeks, in soil, in people's air. And so, what other information was, revealed at that hearing that was critical information that was withheld at the time of the incident?
Yeah, well, Jillian, you put that very politely, a miscommunication. Um, but because of other information that was also withheld, um, we have major problems here with Norfolk Southern's behavior. Um, so it's now clear that Norfolk Southern also withheld other key information from first responders about what chemicals the cars contained for hours to several hours. Uh, Yet, in the first 10 minutes after the derailment, Norfolk Southern sent its contractor, the consulting firm CTEC, a full list of all of the chemicals in a document known as a quote, train consist, unquote. So at the hearing, Eric Brewer, who's the Beaver County's emergency management coordinator, testified that it wasn't until late that night or the next morning that I did learn what was contained in those cars.
Wow.
So, realizing that Norfolk Southern is the best of all Class 1 railroads, there can be no better proof that Norfolk Southern is unworthy of the public's trust and needs to again be strictly regulated along with the rest of the rail operators.
Wow. It's to me, it's shocking to know that the first responders didn't have that information. I've seen a lot of emergency response plans. That's something that, we primarily work on, like well sites, and that's something that uh, every well site has to have a filed ERP. Now, whether those ERPs are adequate is a whole nother ball of wax, and that's actually part of the work that we do to show that they're oftentimes not adequate. But at least we have an idea of, you know, um, who has looked at the plans. They go to the county, they go to the, they're supposed to be reviewed by county and state officials. And it seems like that's a little bit different because it's a piece of infrastructure that's there, that stays there, versus a rail car moves. It moves all around. And so I'm just wondering, in the same vein, like, are the first responders and are the counties and states that these rail cars are going through, are they made aware of all of the things in advance in an emergency evacuation plan or some sort of document like that, of, what type of chemicals are being transported on a regular basis in their town, in their communities, in their counties? And why? And if not, if they don't have this information, why not? I mean, I would think that they would have had that. They should have had that information before the train rolled through the town. I mean,
Uh,
I don't know. Am I wrong in thinking that if you're going to be carrying
no,
hazardous
it's
chemicals
very,
all
yeah,
the
it's
time?
very, what you're saying is very logical and um, and obvious. And it's another example of if you pay your elected representatives enough money, uh, you get to run your business the way you want without regard to the risk. And those first responders are at real risk because they
Yeah.
don't know, in those first few minutes, what's burning, um, and what's in those cars, and that's a real problem. And I think we'll discuss that some more. But um, people hearing what I just said, and your response, they asked me, why on earth would Norfolk Southern behave like this?
Hmm.
And why would they waste 5 tank cars of vinyl chloride? And the answer is the bird and release would get those tracks cleared faster and get the freight moving again. And that is the priority. And that is the mentality. This Chicago to East Palestine, through Pittsburgh to East Coast refineries rail line is admitted by Norfolk Southern to be the most critical east west line in its entire system. And it, as you said initially, it is the most intensively used corridor for transportation of hazardous chemicals and volatile oil in all of North America. So you have to understand the magnitude of this train line
Wow.
and the value of the traffic, the continuous movement of traffic to Norfolk Southern. In East Palestine, both tracks were blocked. The
Wow.
town of East Palestine and the health of their residents and the cost of cleanup are small potatoes to Norfolk Southern. This railroad is making $1 billion a quarter. They will also be recovering money they spend on East Palestine, or on your town, from their insurance company, and from the rail and wheel car manufacturers, and from the manufacturer of vinyl chloride. And
Wow.
that last point is an additional reason for the release and burn and needs more explanation. Norfolk Southern cannot recover from the manufacturer unless the product leaves the rail car. And once the chemical is out of the rail car, the responsibility can be legally be shared. And the community of East Palestine has appeared to have been sacrificed. If
Yeah.
there's a similar derailment in your town, you'll likely suffer the same fate. This one derailment just attracted a little too much attention, but Norfolk Southern is counting on not much changing at all.
Well, and we've got a comment up here. It's been 7 months from the East Palestine vinyl chloride incident, and the federal agency EPA resisted testing over months for an obvious byproduct, dioxin. So we're not just talking about the products that are carried; we're talking about the byproduct of what the like why. The byproduct of the burn itself. So the release of the chemical itself um, caused, and the burn of that chemical caused another chemical to appear or to be created. For folks that don't know, and the folks in East Palestine, I was listening to a YouTube uh, report the other day. There was a really great community meeting that I watched on YouTube about how the folks that are living there are still not getting help after 6-7 months. They're not able to go back in their homes. Their homes are still not safe, and their water is still not safe, and they're not getting any help from anybody. So you would think that if there's all this money that's flowing to Norfolk Southern, that somehow the people that were impacted by this incident should be a priority. And it doesn't sound like they are. Um, and we've got another comment here. Norfolk Southern goes right through Monroeville's rail yard, which is a stone throw from the landfill that accepts fracking waste. So thank you for that, Lois. We're talking about, these rail lines. They go through a lot of different towns throughout the region. And I didn't realize that that was such a highly traveled line, Glenn. And I also didn't realize, I mean, I guess it didn't occur to me that stopping that line stops all transportation until they get it cleaned up. And that was the reason why, or one of the reasons why they wanted it cleaned up so fast, because I guess it didn't occur to me that they would want to get the line up and running before, thinking about the ramifications of doing that, which is, I
Well,
guess, the point.
yeah, and the proof is in the pudding. You recall that they put new rail lines down right over the contaminated soil and ballast to get the line running right after the burn. Um, and then the government finally made them, dig it up um, in pieces and transport it elsewhere. But you're exactly right, and those dioxins and those toxic chemicals, they're going to end up in our rivers eventually, and our water supply. And that's this is really it's like I said, it's an alarm bell,
Mm-hmm.
and what should be happening isn't happening, and that's a problem that is at the doorstep of our elected officials.
Yeah. Well, and you had mentioned previously that the our elected officials are lobbied and given payments, and so that, it seems like, allows them to be to buy self-regulation for themselves. But this is not surprising, though. I think thinking about the oil and gas industry, and in previous conversations on our YouTube, we've mentioned before how there is one lobbyist per legislator, oil and gas legislator here in Pennsylvania. So do you have a sense of, like, how much money is going to politicians? And how many lobbyists there are for the rail industry in Pennsylvania?
Um, Gee, I want to give accurate numbers to that, and that information does exist, but um, there are over 400 rail lobbyists, and I don't know how many of those are from Pennsylvania, but the railroad is giving money to both Democrats and Republicans. They're sharing the wealth and covering their bases both ways. Um, so it's a problem. It's a problem that we'll discuss. But your point about, well, here's, we see similar problems in the petrochemical industry. What you have to realize is that railroads are mobile pipelines, and so they're working together.
Mm-hmm.
This is a workaround to any delays in a pipeline, an actual physical pipeline. They're going to put that oil on the rail cars, on
Yeah.
the rail lines, and that results in even more risk.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what it boils down to too is that we just don't know. First responders don't know, government officials don't know, local people don't know what is being transported on the rails. Um, and there are similar situations in our on our highways. It is not always marked properly. In the case of fracking waste, for instance, it's marked as residual waste. It could be radioactive. It could contain radium 226 and 228. It could contain heavy metals, and it certainly the produced water contains toxic chemicals, and that is not disclosed on the truck. And so or it's not disclosed that that truck is going through your town, so people just don't know. And so it sounds like it's a very similar situation, only to the extreme with the rails, where you can pretty much anything you can carry by pipeline or anything you carry by truck, you can carry quicker and faster, it sounds like, by rail, with these big tankers. So I guess, where do we go from here with regard to changing this situation? Because it seems like it needs to be changed.
See. What the point you raised about getting relief for folks in East Palestine is going to be part of our action items,
Okay.
which we'll show you at the end. I mean,
Okay.
though that community had for months and months
Mm-hmm.
tried to get the Republican governor of Ohio to declare an emergency,
Right.
federal emergency request. And he didn't want to evidently ask the Democratic administration for help, but he finally did.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, what we're suggesting is that everybody on this call take that action item and ask our federal administration to declare an emergency, because these folks need help,
Yeah.
and it sets a precedent. And then there are other action items that we'll get to that have to do with asking our elected officials to do their job,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is to, really, I'd be a whole lot more comfortable if they stopped taking so much money from the rail and chemical lobby, did their job, and started representing people rather than polluters. Um,
Right, because I mean, if you think about it, it's a federal issue, right? It's a state issue, it's a local issue, but it's also a federal issue because
Mhm.
railway is not just staying in one state. It's being
Mhm.
transported, over state lines. So you would think that, with that type of complex system, to regulate, that there would be more regulations,
Mhm.
and not less. But it sounds like that's not the case, and maybe the lobby payments and kind of the fox guarding the hen house is the situation we have here. Um, can you talk a little bit about some specific concrete examples of Norfolk Southern being found um, to have taken shortcuts that cause major health problems and damage in this incident or other incidents as well?
Sure. Norfolk Southern has a history of serious rail bridge accidents in our region. For example, in October 2006, there was an 83-car Norfolk Southern train derailed while crossing the Beaver River Railroad Bridge in New Brighton. 23 tank cars filled with flammable ethanol derailed, ignited, and burned for 48 hours. Some of the unburned ethanol liquid was released into the river and the surrounding soil. Homes and businesses in New Brighton were evacuated for 2 days damages reached 5.8 million. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the probable cause of the derailment was Norfolk Southern's inadequate rail inspection and maintenance program that resulted in a rail fracture from an undetected internal defect. But contributing to the accident, and even more important in my mind, was the Federal Rail Administration's inadequate oversight of the internal rail inspection process and its insufficient requirement for internal rail inspections. And notwithstanding that recommendation, nothing appears to have changed in this regard. And we saw that in the 2018 Station Square derailment. Remember those double stacks. And that derailment report from the FRA again found, quote, serious oversight in Norfolk Southern's operations and inspections. And so, we have a pattern here. We have this really apocalyptic was the right word, derailment in East Palestine. We have, the Harmer derailment last fall, and you don't realize how close that came to contaminating all of Pittsburgh's water supply. We're promised by our politicians that they're going to, for the first time, make railroading more safe. And here we are all these months later, and all we have is a watered down Railway Safety Act bill that's waiting to be voted on in the Senate. And in the last 3 months, which this kind of goes back to, Jillian, your question, the railroad started giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to our senators in lobbying donations on both sides of the aisle. And so that's why the bill is stalled. And, what your audience needs to understand is you're all in the blast zone.
Yeah.
The formal blast zone, in terms of the federal regulations, is 1 mile on either side of the tracks. But other high rail corridor states have a 5-mile blast zone on either side of the tracks. And that cloud of toxic material that we saw in East Palestine, it went all the way to Canada. And so we're all in the blast zone here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, Glenn, that I think this issue, which, it was really hot in the press for a couple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple takeaways are that nothing really has changed as far as regulation goes. And if we want it to change, we're going to have to speak out and say something. 2, that people should understand that mistakes were made. And it seems like a lot of those mistakes could have been prevented. And I think 3, people in East Palestine are still suffering. The people that were impacted by this incident are still suffering and need help, and should be getting it from our federal government, should be getting it from the company that made the disaster in the first place, and that there are things that we can change. There are things that we can do. Do you want to talk? We only have about 5 minutes left. Do you want to talk a little bit about some solutions that you see that could help with this? Because we don't want to just leave folks with some doom and gloom. We want to give people real solutions as to what we can what can be changed. What are some of the solutions out there to the problems that exist?
Well, all of that is well said. I'd like to kind of, in everybody's mind, change the emphasis a little, because emergency response is a fiction. And we all witnessed the shit show after the East Palestine derailment. We have to focus on prevention. The government's pretending that they're prepared. First responders are in peril. And it's irresponsible to pretend that this risk can be managed. Um, Norfolk Southern is not a good neighbor. And if we don't get a handle on this right away, what we'll have is a Norfolk nightmare coming soon to a neighborhood near you. So the rail operators are playing Russian roulette with you. With each passing train, they're spinning the gun cylinder, and we're all literally dodging bullets. And Norfolk Southern's complete arrogance and disregard for health and safety is what drives our grassroots campaign. So, we encourage all of you to use your voice to contact federal and state officials. The more of this that happens at every level, the more difficult it will be for elected leaders to serve polluters instead of their constituents. We're putting a comprehensive list of action items and state rail safety policy reforms in the chat, and also a link for you to connect to RP3's website and sign up for future rail policy reform, safety, and health information. So the first action item is to help secure diesel emissions reduction funding for Norfolk Southern and WabTech, and write to Pennsylvania Senators Casey and Fetterman. We have sample language for you. Number two, to close the loopholes in the Railway Safety Act, that bill that's pending before the Senate. Right now, the head of the largest rail union said that the loopholes are so large you can drive a train through them. So write to your senators using the sample language we have there. And number three, to request policy reforms and improve rail safety and emergency response. Use sample language that we have in number three. Four, we have our contact information for RP3 to get safety updates. And number five is interesting. It's a list of federal and state action items and rails policy reforms. And, you know, when you talk to your state elected representatives, they say, well, it's a federal matter. You know, we can't really do anything. It's preempted. And that's partly true. But what I've listed here are actual state regulations that 6 other very high rail volume corridor states have implemented that are not preempted. And I'll give you just one example. You look at Norfolk Southern's annual report, and it says we don't have enough insurance to cover an explosive derailment. And so what these other states require is for them to post a bond. Pennsylvania has no such protections. It's really simple. So there's lots of things that our state elected representatives can do. And there's a list there. You now have who to write. And, you know, we need to use our voices to get this done.
It sounds not dissimilar to the oil and gas industry and how things are regulated and things are done in that industry. So these are all really great resources. Corey put them in the chat for everybody. So they're in the chat. So you can click on everything in the chat, but then also everything is linked on RP3's website. So that website, if you just look up RP3, you can see all of these actions and more on their website. And Glenn, thank you so much for compiling this information for folks. And we just want to make sure that people really are still, having this in the forefront of their mind, because this is still, people are still being impacted by what happened,
Mhm.
6 months ago. And um, those folks are still not able to, in some circumstances, get to their home. And for what? For what? For one company, it sounds like to make a lot of money, and to get money from the insurance, and to keep moving the cars along the tracks. And I think it's a real shame with regard to protection of people's rights, particularly, here in Pennsylvania, we have the right to clean air and pure water. It seems like those rights, those constitutional rights, our environmental rights amendment, were violated here. And the crazy thing about that is, though, that amendment that was created in the 70s and passed in the 70s as part of our Pennsylvania Constitution, one of the industries that was that the legislators looked to when passing that was one of them was the rail industry, and its contamination of our waterways and our air. So it seems like that is continuing to this day, despite our constitutional rights to clean air and pure water. And there's things that we can do about it. So Glenn, I want to thank you for all your information. I know you have a lot more to share. So if folks want to reach out to Glenn, you can find him. I believe you can find the contact information on RP3's website.
Correct.
There's a contact form if you want to contact Glenn if you have questions about some of the things that he talked about today. He's got a ton more information that we didn't have time for today. So please reach out to him and take action for the health of your community. And I think that that's the best way for us to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again, is to try to change the local and state and federal regulations around rail safety, and just the importance of that information. So thank you so much, Glenn, for your discussion today. And we're hoping that next month we can have maybe some more content on East Palestine. Perhaps we're hoping to reach out to some of the folks that are in those communities and living that experience, to talk about it a little bit more. And then and so we have the rest of our lunch and learns planned out so far for this year. So come back and join us next month. We're going to be here. It's always the last Tuesday of each month at noon. Thank you so much for joining us again, Glenn, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye.
Bye bye.